In class on Wednesday, we discussed Daly's arguments for the moral value of limited inequality. If you don't remember, go back and look at his comments on page 209 and page 214. The quote here, "Balance your surplus now against their present need," is taken from the quote on page 209 from Corinthians in the Bible. So one thing to note is that inequality is fair. So he's not saying that everyone has to be treated equally or have the same amount of stuff. And there are a variety of reasons that he gives for that. And the important thing to note, though, that he's saying is that the amount of inequality could be unfair, and limited equality is what he's saying would be fair. In class, we discussed the Yan-Penn graphic that represented the results of there being no limits on wealth accumulation. And part of the reason for the problem with unlimited inequality is due to growth, according to Daly. Growth, he thinks, tends to lead to unlimited inequality and to an ecologically unsustainable situation. So his thought is that the idea of limited inequality would also entail that growth may be a questionable value for these two reasons, namely that even with limits on wealth accumulation, growth would lead to unlimited inequality, and it would lead to unsustainable economic and ecological conditions or ecological collapse. When Daly talks about limited inequality, he's talking about individual wealth accumulation, not societal wealth accumulation. So if societal wealth were to increase, maybe one could raise the minimum and the maximum amount of wealth or quality of life for people within a society, even though you might preserve the relative limits between individuals. So suppose you stayed within the 10-to-1 limits that Daly recommended in the article. In other words, the richest people make up to 10 times as much as the poorest people. And remember, he said that was just a suggestion. You could have a different way of doing the limits, but we'll just stick with that number for illustration. So he says, suppose we stay within the 10-to-1 limits, but society's wealth were to grow in an absolute sense. Maybe there'd be more people and higher per capita consumption. What would happen? Over time, the worry that Daly has is that limits to inequality could not be maintained. These three sets of bars represent, in the first on the left, suppose the lowest were 10 units of wealth and the highest were 100. In the second, suppose the lowest, the minimum unit of wealth was 50, and on the 10-to-1 ratio, the highest would be 500. And in the third one, the lowest or the minimum would be 100 units of wealth, and the maximum would be 1,000 units of wealth. So notice that the difference between the maximum of the third generation or the third scenario is 100 times, not 10 times the minimum of the first. Thus, growth would lead to vast differences in wealth over time and between generations or between different social scenarios. Notice also that even within a generation, even though the third scenario is still within the 10-to-1 limit, the maximum, the wealthy, are really a lot better off compared to the minimum, and much more so than in the first scenario. Thus, unlimited growth tends to lead to greater and greater gaps between the rich and the poor, and likely to ecological collapse. The ecological collapse, of course, is not represented in this chart. This is just representing the difference in wealth between the minimum and the maximum. So Daly thinks that the alternative to a growth economy is some kind of steady state economy. If, as Daly thinks, there is a finite material basis for productivity, considering all aspects aspects of throughput relative to population and consumption, then more and more growth is not sustainable and will lead eventually to ecological collapse. By the way, Daly notes on page 215 that long before ecological collapse, we will most likely have passed the economic limit beyond which marginal, that is, additional costs of growth, exceed the marginal benefits. In other words, as resources become harder to extract, the cost of extracting them may at some point exceed their benefit, even before they have been completely depleted. So for example, just to take a contemporary thing that we might be familiar with, suppose the costs of extracting, refining, and transporting oil from tar sands in remote locations exceed the benefit. The end product is too costly, the harm to workers or the environment is too great, the amount of energy used to extract is greater than the amount of energy to be gotten from the end product. In other words, there could be lots of factors that would contribute to the marginal costs exceeding the marginal benefits. That's the kind of thing that he's pointing to. In any case, according to Daly, we should be committed to a steady state economy rather than a growth economy because it allows for limited inequality and it leads to a more ecologically sustainable situation. Now, you might want to consider some of these points by Daly about growth versus a steady state economy as you read the short pieces about growth on the course Blackboard site and write up your discussion board topic post on that topic. The articles on growth are a New York Times short debate piece among 4 different people taking different perspectives on the issue of economic growth and its value.